You're born from a woman, and she starts out as your mother, and you would think that you would love your mother no matter what. I love the idea of having a mother, but I don't love her as my mother. And when I see her, I can't help but feel hatred and rage. A lot of people have asked me, have I ever thought about going to visit her? And I usually give the same response. I never want to see her again.
Evil exists in this world when it looks like he's right there in the purple shirt. Evil on this earth, evil incarnate. If you never looked at it, look into those eyes, because there evil sits.
I can't help but agree with her. This was a planned and executed murder of someone. To do something like that, it takes an evil and vile person, and she deserves whatever's gonna happen to her.
This picture, kind of a family picture, which is really our only picture of all of us together as a family. Others may look at it and think, what a happy family. But to me, when I look at it, I can't think of it as a happy picture, because I remember so vividly what led up to it. For me, it's a complete fake smile. It presents a false idea of what the reality of it was. Kimberly and I met through a mutual friend who set us up on a blind date. Went to a movie, which was I Married an Axe Murderer, which I'm not making that up. We had that first date and we really hit it off. You know, she was really charming and beautiful and very kind and understanding. She really valued being a mother, which I had a young child at the time, and so I really valued that. She was just recently divorced. I was recently divorced. We seemed to have a lot in common at that time. The earliest that I really started seeing signs that there was some kind of imbalance there was, we had been dating for a couple of weeks, and she invited me to her divorce support group at her church. And I showed up early, and she was running late.
First time here?
Yeah, mine, my friend Kim, she's a regular.
Okay.
Here to support her.
Thanks.
So I went on in to the meeting, and she came in and kind of made a point of sitting on the other side of the room from me. And I didn't know what was, going on, because she had invited me to this thing. So afterwards, she was acting very kind of mad at me, and I didn't really understand why.
What are you doing? You told me to come. I should have waited for you, I guess.
And she said, "How dare you go into the meeting without me? I invited you to this. You needed to wait for me outside." And this seems like such a small thing, but her change of mood was so quick for something so small, and it kind of left me puzzled as to what was going on with her.
I was just trying to help you.
I don't care what you were trying to do. This is my thing.
I was trying to respond like a normal person would respond. Well, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that.
Thank you for being so understanding.
And then suddenly she gets very romantic and passionate, just completely distracts and kind of makes you forget what just happened. My thought wasn't, wow, something's wrong, I need to get away from this person. It was more like, wow, she really likes me, you know? Kimberly always had her own agenda, and it was her way or the highway.
What did I tell you about this?
I don't remember you saying anything.
I needed to have my gallbladder removed. So I had surgery to have it removed and then went home, and I was heavily medicated and laying on the couch.
This is unbelievable. You can't even follow the simplest of instructions.
And Kimberly got really mad at me because I had put some of my daughter's diapers in a diaper pail that she had said she was saving for something else. And so she just really completely just exploded, was screaming at me.
Next time, listen.
That night, suddenly I was out of medication. There were a couple of times during that time period where I would go to look for my medication and all of a sudden there's just one. Or maybe even I might go and it's completely gone. The bottle's there, but they're all empty, where I swore that, I had more. I never really thought of her as the kind of person who would do that to deliberately make me suffer. But I kind of always assumed that, Kimberly took them. And I know this sounds really kind of pathetic, but I had tried to break up with her on a number of different occasions, but I always allowed myself to get kind of talked back into the relationship. But ultimately, I had finally resolved that I was going to break up with her, and she told me that night that
I'm pregnant.
And she had told me outright that she could not have more children. She had her first child, she said, through a high-risk pregnancy, and her doctor had told her that she was not able to have another child.
I thought you said this was impossible.
I guess it's our little miracle baby.
There is no doubt in my mind that she did that deliberately, and that she knew that she could get pregnant, and that she deliberately got pregnant.
All I'm saying is that we can do this as a team without being a couple.
And so we were having an argument, and I just said, I'm out. I can't do this.
You're just pathetic.
I'll be there for you through the pregnancy, but I can't marry you. We can't be together. But, I can still be part of the child's life.
You're just gonna ditch out on your obligations?
And she said, no, absolutely not. If you want to be part of this baby's life, we're going to be married. The idea of having a child out in the world and not being a part of his life is just unthinkable for me.
What, you want to get married?
So we decided to get married.
I think that's our best option, sweetheart.
And frankly, the wedding for me was not a happy occasion. I remember really clearly right before just going out behind the house and just kind of having a good crying session, that knowing that this is not gonna last. This is Kimberly holding Jamie, in his first hours of life. And I think what this represents to me at the time was just some hope that things could be better than what they were. When Jamie is an adult, I need to be able to look at myself in the mirror and say that I had given everything that I have to give. She threw the hammer, and it kind of whizzed by my head. She was trying to kill me. I remember I had come home late from work. It was really late. I was exhausted. One of Kimberly's favorite things was just as I was about to fall asleep, she wants to start talking.
Hey, did you fix the garbage disposal like I asked?
About, not really pleasant things about maybe problems we'd had or whatever. We started arguing about it.
So what, we're just supposed to let the dishes pile up and live in a trash heap?
Eventually, I just had enough, and I got up. She was in full-on rage.
Don't you walk away from me when I am talking to you!
She just kind of looks like a wild woman and is screaming pretty much at the top of her voice. I don't know where she got the hammer from, but she took the hammer and she just flung it right at me. And I dodged, but it just happened to just stick right into the wall. I've never really been in a situation where I felt like someone was trying to kill me. And honestly, I don't know whether she had murder on her mind at that point, but it felt like it. And I took a picture of it to have absolute proof that that is, in fact, going on. The hammer in the wall, it's right about eye level in the wall. We both did leave it in the wall for at least a couple of days. And for me, it was almost symbolic, like I was gonna leave it there for her to see what she did. But she didn't do anything. She just left it there. It's hard to say whether I really, really knew her. The potential was there all along that she could murder someone. When I first got custody of Jamie, I had this idea that the nightmare's over, But there was an incident that happened at my house wherein Jamie and I got in kind of a scuffle.
He was watching a TV show, and I stood up front of the TV and I said,
I don't want to watch this.
and he said, no, you need to move.
If you change the channel, I'll move.
I'm not changing anything. We're watching this.
And I said, no, I'm not gonna move. He is like, okay, well, I will move you.
What did I say? Jamie, get out of the way.
So he moved me and I started pushing him, locking arms and kind of tug-warring against each other. I had fallen and hit my head on a corner of a TV stand. So I called my mom. My mother was a master manipulator. My mom decided to talk to a lawyer the next day and have me write down what had happened word for word on an affidavit. And a lot of the things that happened, she was telling me to write down as I was writing it.
It says, last night on November 11th at 8:45 p.m., my dad and I were watching TV We disagreed on a show. I stood in front of the TV. My dad got angry and picked me up by my shirt and body slammed me down to the floor. True, he stood in front of the TV. True, we disagreed on a show. Then, saying pick me up by my shirt and body slam me down to the floor, that part was not true at all. The way she manipulates is she will take a small grain of truth about something that happened and then frame it in such a way that suits her agenda, that makes her look good. The judge immediately took him out of my custody and gave him back to Kimberly.
My relationship with my mom was very weird.
Jamie, come have a seat.
One moment she's saying, come sit on my lap and watch TV with me.
How's school been going? Good. Yeah.
And then let's say I get a stain on my shirt.
What is this?
The entire mood would change. She would just flip the script super quick. And, she would start yelling at me.
What, are you a slob or something?
And call me horrible names. And I would say back, I hate you. I never want to see you again.
I hate it here. I want to live with Dad.
Oh, you want to live with your father?
Fine.
And so I got out of the house.
Mom.
She locked the door. And I was in some athletic shorts and a t-shirt, and it was freezing cold. I don't even know how long I was out there. I probably was out there for hours. But I remember calling my dad and saying, hey, please come get me, please come get me.
Hey, Daddy, it's me. I'm outside my house. Could you just please call back this number? It's Jamie. Bye.
A lot of the time when I would call him and say, please come get me, he would say, well, I can't, because that would be violating the court order.
If I go against, the agreement, then it will make it even harder for him to ever come live with me. There were even times when I had called the police department and talked to them, and they said, well, this is not a criminal matter, there's nothing we can do. That's the cruel irony of it, is that he has to be obviously injured, badly injured, in order for me to take some kind of action. And by then, it's kind of too late.
I remember it was picture day at school, so she, makes me put on a colored shirt, makes me wear nice shorts, make sure my shoes are white. Or my mom would part my hair down the middle and use, half a bottle of hairspray. And, that was kind of a dorky haircut. When I get to the school, I just hated wearing that hair so much, just wanted to mess it all up.
Did you get the pictures?
She paid about $40 for the brand new school pictures, all different sizes. They ended up coming in and my hair was messed up and she lost her mind.
This is an embarrassment.
How could you do that? You're a stupid moron, stuff like that. And eventually it got to the point where she started pinning me up against the wall and smacked me like 30, 40 times as hard as she could.
No, I paid for these. What is wrong with you? Do you think that this is funny? Do you like looking like a slob?
I was never punched in the eyes or the face. I was always punched like in the ribs or the stomach or the arms because, my mom would make sure that people didn't know what was going on behind the scenes.
And now you know what happens
when you don't do what I tell you.
One thing that I really regret is not saying anything to my dad. He didn't really know about all this stuff that was happening because I never really tell anybody. I just kind of kept it a secret for many, many years.
Over the years, he would come to my house when I would ask him about a bruise or an injury or whatever, and he would say, yeah, you know, I was wrestling with my brothers or whatever. And he was a pretty rambunctious kid, so it was really hard to know what, if any, bruises were attributed directly to Kimberly's treatment of him.
I did my mom's laundry and my brother's laundry, and I cleaned the kitchen and cooked dinner sometimes. And, you know, it's a lot to do. And if those things didn't get done, she would get really angry. I was doing laundry.
Did you fold your clothes?
And I put my clothes in the drawer. And I just crammed them in there. I didn't fold them at all. And she always wanted me to fold the clothes perfect.
Nope. Exactly what I thought. Stand up. Stand up.
I remember her yelling and screaming at me.
And all of these. You're gonna do it over again. Do you understand me?
She was gonna lock me in the room. When you have a lock on a door in a room, that's usually on the inside of the room. But what she did is she unscrewed the doorknob and switched the lock to the outside of the room. So I couldn't get out. And she kept me in that room for hours. It was past dinner time. I would say, hey, I really have to go to the bathroom. And she would make me wait. I finally decided that, you know, I couldn't hold it anymore, so I kicked out the screen guarding the window, and I just decided I was gonna pee out of the window. That's not normal at all, but I thought that that's how you got grounded as a kid. Things were not good between my mom and I. I was trying to play video games to pass the time. That Xbox was the only thing that could keep my mind off of being stuck in that house. And my mother was getting on my case about playing too many video games.
What's your problem?
My problem?
My problem is that you're standing around all day.
Whatever.
And she unplugged it, and I just got super angry, like more angry than I probably have ever been. And I took the Xbox and I threw it outside of the window. And that's when things escalated. She took the cord of the Xbox and like wrapped it around my neck and started to pull back. It was just blind rage. All you can do is just feel scared and helpless, and that you hope the person behind you doing that to you will stop. Zach got up and said, please stop choking him, because he saw that I was starting to grasp for air. 5 seconds more, gonna pass out or die maybe. She stopped, and I think I was able to get my phone after that and called the police and got the police involved. I was under the impression that cops are there to help you.
I'm so sorry, officers. I don't know what to do. He's out of control.
She's lying.
Quiet, okay? We'll get to you in a second.
But when you have a parent like mine who can, weave in and out of words and mess with people's heads and manipulate people, I can't really blame the cops for being manipulated by my mom.
And that's when he just lost it. He just lost it.
And then what happened? Did he hit you or anything?
She would make sure that she was crying to make sure that she looked like she was the victim in that situation. And she said I was pushing her against the wall, and I was on top of her at one point on the ground. I was made out to be the sole bad guy in this situation. My mom was made out to be as a mom struggling against a disobedient child. The big thing about it was that she would have my brother involved, so it was 2 against 1 in that situation.
Zach, baby, you know what a monster your brother is, right?
My mom had basically told my brother to lie.
Sometimes he can be quite angry.
Zach, just like I did, faced a lot of abuse. I just remember seeing a confused little kid tearing his heart in half between helping his brother and staying loyal to his mom, and he felt that he had to follow with what she was saying.
Whenever they get into fights, he kind of loses control of himself.
And that's what Zach told the police. I don't blame him for that. I don't blame him for that at all, but I definitely blame my mom for manipulating the situation to her advantage. Ended up, I got a citation, I believe, for an assault, but they ended up dismissing that. When I went back, she said, if you ever tell anybody, if you tell your dad, if you tell your teachers at school, if you tell your counselors, if you tell anybody, I will kill you. She wanted this picture to look normal. It may look like we're happy, but I definitely wasn't feeling that way on the inside. All I can see is the mother that I was trying to get away from. No matter how happy we look, that's all I see. I had gotten in trouble at school. I got called into the principal's office. And I remember I was just freaking out because they had to call my mom. All I knew was I didn't want to go home because I knew what was going to happen. So I ran away after school. I just went to this grocery store and tried to hide in the very back of the grocery store. And I stayed there until about 8 or 9 o'clock. All I wanted to do was just hide out, was just try to stay away from any harm that would come my way when I go home. Maybe somebody would help me. Maybe they'd see me back there and help me.
What's going on?
I ended up getting caught back there by a store manager.
You okay?
I remember trying to tell him that I'm scared to go home. Let me stay here for the night.
What's going on at home?
I don't feel safe anymore. She's crazy.
I think we need to call the cops and let them help you out.
No, please don't do that.
No, all I knew was I didn't want to go home because I knew what was going to happen.
I promise. They're gonna help you out.
He felt like he needed to call the police, and eventually, maybe 20 minutes later, 25 minutes later, I think the police finally came, and the police took me home after that. I think I ran away from home maybe 5 or 6 times. Each time the cops looked for me. They said, if you run away anymore from home, you're gonna get put in juvie. And I always felt like it was another stab in the back from the cops. My dad didn't know the real reasons why I ran away. He only knew what I was telling him. I remember the feeling of being stuck. That was the biggest feeling of them all, was, feeling like you're in a hole that you can't get out of. And I felt that no matter what I did, nobody was gonna help me.
She moved a lot. She moved around a lot. I mean, like probably 6 or 8 times in a year's time. And I would kind of track that. I still had to go and pick Jamie up for a visitation, so I pretty much saw every place that she lived.
So I'm not 100% sure why we moved around a lot. When we would pack those bags and we'd pack our boxes, we were trying to get out of there as fast as possible.
I think it's very possible that the reason she would kind of bounce from place to place was that the longer she was at one place, the more she would start to kind of expose what her MO with her children and just with her life in general. But I think that the idea that people began to understand her and kind of catch on the longer she stayed.
I was in my mom's room when I wasn't supposed to be. I was playing in her room.
What the hell are you doing?
She doesn't like it when anybody goes into her room.
I told you a million times, right?
She pushed me. She got to the point of uncontrollable rage. And she was banging my head against the hardwood floor. And I turned over and she started choking me with her hands. My vision started to go just ever so slightly black. I remember feeling that my mom was killing me, basically. It's a hard thing to describe, your mother hurting you in the worst way possible. At that point, I had tried to fight back. Thank God she let go. I'd finally had enough, and I ran out of the house, contacted my dad, and he took pictures. And I think that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
This might be one of the most important pictures I've ever taken in my life. This incident, as horrific as it was, really enabled me to take actual action. Now I have something. I have something that I can pull you out of that.
The main reason I never told you, all the years of abuse and stuff like that is I just felt that if, I told you, somehow my mom would find out. She had threatened me that if I told anybody that I would die. And that's why I was just so scared all those years to really let you know what was happening.
And for me, that feeling of guilt, is pretty heavy. Something I still feel a lot today.
I can't blame you for any of that.
I mean, I can tell you with 100% honesty that I did everything that I could possibly do.
And I believe you with all my heart, I really do.
Jamie, honey, I need you to pack your things.
My grandmother told me we need to go as soon as possible and that she'll tell me later what's going on.
Is it my mom?
I know it has something to do with my mom. I know she did something. I felt this horrible sense of anxiety. Like, I remember just feeling worried and that Luke wasn't really safe.
Leave it. We can go. Let's go.
When I found out that she was suspected in a murder case, it was almost as if I knew it was always going to happen. I was visiting my mom every other weekend to see how Luke was doing, and I would try to go in there and like play with him and make sure he was okay. I remember just feeling worried, but you know, I was also trying to finally live a normal life with my dad as well. When my mother found Cherry as a babysitter for my younger brother Luke, I remember there was a lot of custody battles between my brother's dads and my mother. She had lost me, she had lost Zach, and now she was losing Luke, her last son. Cherry Walker was a really, really genuine, nice, good person. She really adored and loved Luke a lot.
It's a picture of Cherry Walker. She was a lovely person. She was kind of a pure soul in so many ways. I can't help but to look at her as kind of a martyr for us, a symbol of the hideousness of what Kimberly did. I remember it so clearly. My phone buzzed, and I looked down, and it was Kimberly's mother. And she said, you know, do you know Cherry Walker? Her body was found burned out in the country. Literally, my first words were just, no. I mean, it was kind of mind-numbing almost. It was so surreal. Kimberly was the #1 suspect from the very minute they discovered who Cherry was.
If you were the captain, what would be your name?
There was a CPS hearing, and Cherry was subpoenaed. So once that happened, I think Kimberly just became desperate.
How fast is Mach 2?
And so in order to prevent her from testifying, Kimberly, you know, killed her.
Yeah?
Kimberly's version of the events was that she picked up Cherry Walker to have dinner to talk to her about her testimony in the upcoming CPS trial, that Cherry had a seizure and that she stopped breathing and then went driving around for a while to try and figure out what to do. She decides that she needs to take her out in the country, took some lighter fluid out of the back of her car, squirted it all over her body, and lit her on fire. When Kimberly's mother called me and told me about this, Jamie was actually with her. And part of the reason that she called me was that they were basically leaving town. The DA had arranged for them to stay in a hotel, kind of a protected place that, you know, Kimberly wouldn't know, just in case there were any kind of threat. It's just been really, really difficult to get my head around the idea that Kimberly would actually deliberately and premeditatively do that, take someone's life.
The first time I'd seen my mom since the news, and the last time I've seen my mom at all, was when I took the stand. They make you stand up, say your name, point, and say, I recognize Kimberly Diane Cargill. I saw a woman who was broken beyond repair. I remember her eyes were like steel, like just cold, lifeless. That's all I could see was the eyes of a murderer.
In their closing arguments, the state prosecutors told the jury that Cargill was a liar, a killer, and a monstrous child abuser. They then urged the jury to sentence the death penalty when deciding her fate.
I didn't realize how much of an impact my testimony would mean. And I felt really bad because I wouldn't want anybody to die because of me. But I just felt like justice had been served. That finally, all the years and years of abuse, all the times I'd call the police, all the times that she had hit me or my brothers, I felt like all of that finally came to an end. I got in fights at school, I got in fights with my dad. I acted out. I didn't want to go to counseling, I didn't want to go to therapy. I used heroin just to numb it. And eventually I decided that I need to turn my life around or I'm gonna end up just like my mother. I decided to go to rehab and I've worked.
The desert never forgets. It buries. It swallows. It hides everything beneath sand and silence until one day the wind shifts and the truth rises like a ghost clawing its way back into the light. That's what they still whisper in the outskirts of Maricopa County, the place where heat shimmers on the asphalt like a fever and night falls with a stillness too quiet to trust. It was here in the spring of 2001 when a story began that no one could finish a cold case that chilled even the desert sun, a disappearance so abrupt it felt like the earth itself had devoured a human being. No screams, no struggle. No witnesses, just a young woman vanishing into thin air on a road that should have been mundane but somehow became the gateway to a nightmare the community never outran. Her name floated through the air for years like a forbidden word, something people lowered their voices to say as if the desert itself were listening. And even now, after over 2 decades, the first image that returns to anyone who lived through that year is the same headlights cutting through the Arizona dusk, a stalled car by the roadside, and a single open door swinging gently in the breeze, tapping against the frame like a warning that came too late. Some say the air felt different that evening, heavier charged as though something unseen hovered just beyond the brush. Others insist they heard nothing at all, not even the desert animals that usually creep close after dusk. Silence, they say, a silence that didn't feel natural. The sheriff's deputies who arrived first described the scene as eerily intact. Her phone was on the passenger seat, her bag was untouched, the keys were still in the ignition. The engine had died, but everything else looked normal, almost staged except for one detail, the faint, sharp line of footprints leading away from the car vanishing abruptly after 30 paces, as if swallowed by the sand. The story spread faster than wildfire. People called it strange, unnerving, impossible. Some used the phrase cold case before it even became one. Others whispered darker possibilities, abduction desert cults, human traffickers, someone she knew too well. But the truth was simpler and more horrifying. No one had a clue what happened. Families locked their doors earlier. Teenagers who used that road started taking the long way around, and the deputies kept circling the area long after midnight, scanning the brush with flashlights that illuminated nothing but dust. Something in that emptiness got under their skin, lodged in their bones. You don't forget a scene like that even after decades. And as the weeks became months, the story thickened with the weight of fear, speculation, and frustration. People wanted answers, any answers, but the investigation moved like a ghost through walls, hands grasping at nothing. Every lead dissolved as soon as it appeared. Every theory turned to sand. Her family refused to accept silence. They pushed and pressed, demanding the county work harder, dig deeper, look again, look further. They organized search parties stretching miles across desert terrain that seemed endless and unforgiving. They knocked on doors that hadn't been opened in years. They confronted strangers at gas stations, diners, and rest stops, but the trail died faster than hope could be rebuilt, leaving them with a haunting question. How could someone vanish without a trace in a place so open, so exposed, so brutally simple? The detectives assigned to the case knew the pattern well, too well. A stalled car, a vanished driver, a sudden void in the timeline with zero signs of struggle. The profile suggested someone she trusted, someone who didn't need to force their way into the moment, but who her friends insisted she didn't have enemies. Her coworkers claimed she never acted afraid of anyone. Her neighbors described her as warm, kind, open-hearted. But open-hearted can be dangerous in the wrong desert. And somewhere beneath the sand, a truth waited, patient, silent, merciless. The case went from active investigation to mystery, from mystery to rumor, from rumor to legend, and finally to that dreaded phrase stamped across the file: cold case. A label that feels like frostbite on the skin, like someone giving up even when the detectives swear they haven't. Years passed. Files were transferred from desk to desk, evidence degraded. Witness memories blurred into fog. The desert kept its silence. And then came the night the sheriff's office phone rang with a voice on the line that felt like a tremor through time. A hiker, a remote path, something glinting beneath a collapsed section of rock. Not a body, not remains. Something stranger, something long lost, preserved by accident, protected by the desert the same way it hides. A metal object, a small one. Rusted but intact and engraved. Her initials. The deputies who responded recognized the significance immediately. It wasn't just a clue, it was a spark. Something forgotten, rising to the surface like a warning, like a confession from the land itself. When they unearthed the object fully, they found more beneath it, items that should have disintegrated, but didn't, preserved by the perfect conditions of a shaded crevice untouched by rain or wind. The discovery was like a door cracking open after decades of being sealed. The press arrived within hours. Headlines exploded. Arizona 2001 cold case revived after shocking find. People who hadn't spoken her name in years whispered it again, this time with something like dread. The evidence was transported to a sterile room lit by fluorescent lights where technicians breathed slow and careful, as though afraid any movement might disturb the fragile timeline waking up on the table. Fingerprint kits, DNA swabs, microtrace analysis. It was a symphony of forensic hope humming in the background, while detectives leaned in, watching with eyes that hadn't forgotten the stalled car, the empty road, the footprints that ended too soon. For the first time in 2 decades, the case felt alive. What they found next wasn't just surprising, it was impossible. The material trapped inside the recovered item held skin cells so well preserved that DNA extraction succeeded on the first attempt, a partial profile incomplete but usable. A miracle, by forensic standards, a miracle the desert shouldn't have allowed. And when that fragment of identity was fed into the system, it returned a hit so unexpected it stopped the entire room cold. Not a stranger, not a drifter, not an unknown predator. Someone local. Someone who had been interviewed in 2001. Someone who had stood in the very room where detectives had reviewed maps, logs, witness statements. Someone who had shaken hands with the sheriff and said, "I hope you find whoever did this." Someone who had inserted themselves into the search parties. Someone who had walked past that stalled car in the days after, pretending to mourn, blending into the grief, hiding behind community concern like a mask they never intended to take off. The realization spread through the department like a slow, chilling ripple. A name was spoken in a whisper, then again louder, then whispered again, almost in disbelief. They didn't want it to be true. They couldn't believe the case had been sitting in plain sight for 24 years, wearing the face of a neighbor, a friend, a volunteer. The shock radiated outward, reaching every corner of the community. People who had invited him into their homes froze in horror. People who had trusted him felt the ground tilt beneath their feet. It was betrayal at a scale no one can prepare, for the kind that makes you question every memory, every smile, every conversation. And as the news broke, Arizona 2001 cold case solved, long-lost evidence exposes the killer. The town trembled with the weight of truth crashing down after decades of denial. But this wasn't closure, not yet. This was just the desert exhaling after holding its breath for far too long, releasing a story that would only get darker from here, a story whose final chapter had waited in silence, buried just beneath the surface. He didn't run. That was the part everyone struggled to understand. When the deputies knocked on his door in the early morning haze, he answered as if nothing in the world had shifted, as though the ground beneath his porch wasn't trembling, with 2 decades of buried truth clawing its way upward. He stood there in a faded t-shirt, rubbing sleep from his eyes, blinking into the harsh beam of reality crashing over him. And for a moment, watching him, the deputies hesitated, because predators usually sense when the hunt finally turns in their direction, but not him. He simply exhaled, nodded once, and stepped aside as if he had been waiting for this moment longer than they had. The house felt too normal, too painfully ordinary. A coffee mug drying beside the sink, a half-read newspaper on the table, a TV remote resting on the arm of the couch, a quiet, domestic stillness that made the investigators' skin crawl. They searched room by room, not because they expected to find anything monumental, but because procedure demanded thoroughness. Yet with every door opened, every drawer slid out, a feeling grew an undercurrent that something was off, not visibly, but spiritually, as if the house itself held its breath. And when they found the box, a small wooden container tucked behind a row of old hiking boots, the desert wind outside seemed to shift. Inside the box were items so mundane they would mean nothing to a stranger: a pressed wildflower, a faded map, a scrap of fabric, a broken keychain. But for the detectives who knew her story, each object struck with the force of a gut punch. These were small pieces of her world, fragments she had once carried, without knowing they would become relics of a life frozen in time. He didn't deny the box was his. He didn't flinch. He looked at it with the calm of a man revisiting a memory he had buried but not forgotten. And the officers knew then guilt wasn't the right word. This was possession. They cuffed him gently as if afraid to rupture the fragile moment, and as he walked to the patrol car, neighbors gathered behind curtains, behind cracked doors, behind fences that suddenly felt like meaningless lines between normal life and the unthinkable. Some of them recognized him instantly. He had mowed their lawns, helped them move furniture, attended their barbecues. Now he walked across the gravel with wrists locked in steel and the world tipped sideways. The shock moved through the crowd like static, leaving an eerie hush in its wake. At the station, he sat in the interrogation room beneath a humming light that flickered just enough to scratch at the nerves of everyone watching through the one-way glass. He didn't ask for a lawyer right away. He didn't ask for water or a phone call or an explanation. He simply placed his hands on the table and stared at them with a quiet that felt wrong, unnatural, as though he were studying someone else's skin. When the lead detective finally walked in, a man who had inherited the case long after the desert tried to erase it, there was no theatrics, no banging fists, no litany of accusations. Just a folder placed gently on the table and a voice that carried the weight of 24 lost years. "We found something," the detective said. A small statement, but it filtered through the room like smoke. The suspect looked up, eyes tired, hollow, almost relieved. Not defensive, not angry, relieved. And that's when the first crack appeared. He sighed, a long, slow release of breath, as though he'd been holding it since 2001. But relief is not confession. Not yet. The detective watched him carefully, sensing the shift, but refusing to push too fast. The desert teaches patience. The truth emerges when it's ready. Hours passed. Words drifted like sand, sparse, subtle, circling the core of something monstrous. And each time the detective pressed close, the suspect retreated into silence, staring at his hands again, as if the memories trapped beneath his skin were louder than any voice in the room. Meanwhile, the evidence lab hummed with a different kind of tension. Technicians moved with surgical precision, comparing DNA profiles, cross-checking trace materials, running tests on the newly discovered items, with an urgency sharpened by the knowledge that this wasn't just a case. It was a wound in the community that had never healed. And now, with each new result, the wound reopened, raw and bleeding. But the most unsettling discovery didn't come from DNA or fingerprints. It came from a small metal component lodged inside the recovered object, a tiny screw, rusted but identifiable, belonging to a very specific model of tool manufactured in the late 90s. Only a handful of hardware stores in the region had ever carried it, and one of them was the place where the suspect had worked as a part-time clerk in 2001. A store receipt from 24 years earlier suddenly became a knife cutting through layers of desert dust. Still, evidence is not truth until storytelling transforms it into meaning. And the truth needed a voice. Back in the interrogation room, the detective slid a photograph across the table, the object found beneath the rock still caked in sand, carrying her initials like a whisper from another lifetime. The suspect stared at it for a long time. Too long. His jaw tightened. A single muscle beneath his eye twitched. And then softly he said, "I thought it was gone." Not an admission, not yet. But it cracked open the silence enough for the detective to lean in. "Tell me what happened." And the suspect's lips parted as if he wanted to answer, but the words refused to come. Instead, he shook his head and whispered, "You don't understand." A phrase that detectives hear often, usually from the guilty, but this time it sounded different, less like deflection and more like dread. As if the truth itself frightened him. Hours stretched. The suspect grew more restless. At one point he stood up and paced hands, trembling slightly, as though memories approached like shadows cast by an unseen flame. But every time he neared the threshold of confession, he pulled back into silence, gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. Outside the room, the sheriff's office flooded with reporters. Cameras flashed. Words like cold case solved, long-lost evidence, shocking arrest ricocheted through hallways that had never known such urgency. Old detectives who had worked the case in 2001 returned with faces carved by time, their expressions hardening as they learned the suspect's name again. Some of them remembered him clearly, a helpful man, always offering assistance, always volunteering. And now they wondered what else he had volunteered. Back in town, fear thickened the air. Parents pulled their children closer. People replayed old memories, trying to recall any strange behavior, any odd comment, any moment that might have meant something. But the truth was simpler and more terrifying. He had blended in perfectly. A ghost wearing a friendly smile. Night settled over the desert like a dark curtain, and still the suspect sat in the interrogation room, silent. The detective stepped out briefly, leaving him alone with the hum of the fluorescent light, and in that thin sliver of solitude, something shifted. The suspect's shoulders slumped, his hands loosened. He looked up at the glass, not at his reflection, but at the people he knew were watching on the other side. Then he spoke a sentence so soft the microphones barely caught it. "I didn't mean for it to happen." The detective re-entered instantly, heart pounding with the weight of the moment, but just as quickly as the door opened, the suspect recoiled, shaking his head, whispering, No, I can't," as if the truth had burned him. The detective knew better than to push. He simply sat down, folded his hands, and waited. Patience, like the desert. Minutes trickled by. The suspect's breathing grew louder, uneven, almost ragged. He pressed his palms to his temples, eyes squeezed shut, fighting something inside himself. When he finally spoke again, the tremor in his voice made the detective sit up straighter. "They'll blame me," he whispered. The detective answered calmly, "Who?" But the suspect didn't respond. He just stared at the wall with a hollow terror that didn't fit the profile the department had built around him. A terror that felt misplaced, misdirected, as though the killer he feared wasn't himself. It was then that the detective realized something chilling. This wasn't a confession. This was fear. And fear only makes sense when something darker waits in the shadows, something the suspect believed was still out there, still watching, still capable of burying the truth deeper than the desert ever could. Whatever happened in 2001 wasn't simple, wasn't clean, wasn't isolated. There was another presence in the story, unseen, unnamed, untouched. And for the first time since the evidence resurfaced, the detective felt the cold, unmistakable grip of a possibility no one had considered. They might have arrested the wrong man. The moment the detective felt the shift, that subtle undercurrent of dread radiating from the suspect, the air in the interrogation room tightened like a fist closing slowly around everyone's throat. Something wasn't aligning. Something in the suspect's trembling voice, the fractured sentences, the way his eyes kept flicking to the corners of the room as if expecting a shadow to peel itself from the wall, all of it carried a warning no one had the courage to translate aloud. And, for the first time since the evidence surfaced, the detective sensed that they were standing not at the end of a mystery, but at the threshold of a deeper one. While the suspect's fear rippled through the room, the rest of the station thrummed with noise reporters outside, shouting questions, phones ringing relentlessly, officers walking briskly through hallways, carrying files that suddenly mattered more than they had for 24 years. But in that room, the world narrowed to the sound of one man's unsteady breath. The detective leaned forward, slightly just enough to show he was listening, but not enough to spook the fragile thread holding the suspect together. "You said someone will blame you?" The detective murmured, his voice low, measured. "Who is they?" The suspect swallowed hard, a movement so sharp it echoed in the silence. His fingers twitched against the table, tapping an uneven rhythm, as though he were signaling a message only he understood. When he finally spoke, the words were strained, dragged from somewhere dark inside him. "I'm not the only one who was out there." A chill threaded through the detective's spine. The desert can hide many things, bones, secrets, intentions, but it rarely hides accomplices for long, and yet in all the years no second figure had ever surfaced. No rumors, no sightings, just this man, this house, this box. Out where the detective pressed gently, the suspect's eyes darted sideways again. Not toward the door, toward the mirrored glass, not looking at his reflection, but looking through it, as if he could sense eyes watching on the other side. He shivered just once and whispered, "They told me not to say anything." The detective held his breath. "Who told you?" A painful pause. The suspect clenched his fists. "I can't." The detective didn't push. Not yet. He allowed the silence to sit, to swell, to grow heavy enough that the suspect's thoughts had no room to run. Slowly, the suspect exhaled a trembling stream of air, as if surrendering a piece of himself. "They said the desert keeps secrets if you treat it right." Another chill, another fracture in the story, another question opening instead of closing. Before the detective could continue, there was a knock at the door. Soft, urgent. An officer stepped in, leaned close, and whispered something into the detective's ear. Whatever it was, it made his expression sharpen instantly, like a blade being unsheathed. He excused himself, leaving the suspect alone with his shadows. In the observation hallway, the officer handed him a folder. "Sir." The lab rushed the new samples. The detective flipped it open. For a moment, his eyes scanned the report calmly, then sharply, then with a tension that tightened his jaw. 2 sets of DNA, not one. 2. One matched the suspect, partially, weakly, not definitive, not the kind of match you could convict with. The other, unknown. Not in any database, not in any state registry, not linked to any previous case. A ghost in genetic form, someone who had touched the recovered objects, someone present at the right moment in 2001, someone who had walked the same stretch of desert and left behind a biological fingerprint time tried to erase. A presence, unidentified, and very real. A low drumbeat of unease pulsed through the detective's chest as he returned to the interrogation room. The suspect looked up, fear etched deeper into his face, as though he sensed the shift without needing to hear a word. The detective sat down, carefully placing the folder on the table, but not opening it. "There's someone else," he said quietly. The suspect flinched. A tiny movement, but enough. "We found another DNA profile," the detective continued. "Not yours." The suspect's breath hitched. His fingers curled inward, gripping the fabric of his jeans. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to explain it. Instead, a single tear tracked down his cheek, not the tear of grief or guilt, but of someone cornered by a truth too heavy to bear. "They told me nobody would ever find out," he whispered hoarsely. The detective leaned forward. "Who told you?" Silence, and then footsteps in the hallway. Fast, urgent. Another knock. The detective's patience was beginning to crack. This time, an officer held out a printed image, a satellite photo. A time-stamped overhead shot taken by an environmental survey drone earlier that afternoon. The officer's voice was stiff. "Sir, you need to see this." The detective looked, and something inside him twisted in disbelief. The site where the object had been found earlier, the shaded crevice near the rockfall, now showed fresh disturbance. Sand shifted, rocks overturned, a new footprint impression barely visible but unmistakable in the drone's infrared overlay. Someone had returned to the site within the last hour. Someone who knew exactly where the evidence came from. The suspect could not have gone back. He had been in custody all day. The detective felt cold sweat form along the back of his neck. He turned the photo around and placed it in front of the suspect. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. The suspect stared, his face drained of color, his lips parted in horror, not surprise, his breathing quickened. "They went back," he whispered. The detective's voice tightened. "Who went back?" The suspect's eyes lifted slowly, haunted, desperate, as if he were begging the detective to understand something he could not say aloud. "They're still out there." A sentence, sharp as a blade. And with it, the atmosphere in the room shifted entirely. The detective felt the walls closing in, not metaphorically, but literally, like the truth itself was pressing inward from every corner of the desert. "There was someone else with you?" the detective asked. The suspect shook his head violently. "No, not with me, ahead of me. They knew the area better than anyone. They knew where to walk so their tracks wouldn't show. They told me to leave, and I did." His voice cracked. "I didn't know they would. I didn't think—" The detective leaned closer. "Give me a name." The suspect's shoulders trembled. He pressed his hands flat against the table, trying to steady himself. But when he opened his mouth, no name came out, just a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob. "I can't think," he choked. "They see everything." For a moment, the detective felt a flicker of something he hated to acknowledge, the tiniest pulse of fear, not of the suspect, but of the unknown factor sitting just outside the timeline, untouched and unhindered, now moving through the desert again like a ghost retracing old footprints. The detective stood abruptly. "We need patrols at the site," he told the officer at the door. "Now. Full perimeter." As orders echoed through the hall, the suspect slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. The detective didn't leave the room. Not yet. Not with the tremor in the suspect's shoulders, not with the way the lights hummed overhead, like static, thickening the air. Finally, the suspect lifted his head. "They're not done," he whispered. The detective froze. "What do you mean?" A long silence, a trembling breath. "They told me once, the desert only keeps secrets if you leave it undisturbed." His voice dropped into something hollow, nearly lifeless. "You disturbed it." The detective felt the temperature in the room drop, not physically, but in that way instinct warns you something is wrong. Deeply wrong. Wrong in a way training manuals can't prepare you for. Outside the room, the station erupted with activity officers rushing, phones ringing, orders shouted. But inside, time stalled again, held hostage by one man's trembling voice and the shadow of someone unseen, someone who had just returned to the place where the evidence had been buried for 24 years. The detective stared at the suspect, studying the raw terror etched into every line of his face. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, "that whoever was out there in 2001 is active again?" The suspect didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't hesitate. "Yes." The word left his lips like a verdict, and in its wake an awful realization hardened in the detective's chest. They hadn't solved the cold case. They had reopened something much worse. The desert night stretched wide and hollow. As the detective stepped out into the parking lot, a thin sheen of sweat clinging to his skin despite the late hour. The sky above was a blank canvas of darkness, unbroken, unmoving, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Patrol cars idled, with engines humming, radios crackling with clipped voices as officers organized the perimeter around the discovery site. Lights strobed across the asphalt, throwing sharp angles of shadow that made everything look uneven, unstable. A tension hung in the air so thick it felt almost alive, like a second presence that had arrived uninvited and settled onto everyone's shoulders. He watched the swarm of activity for a moment, feeling the weight of the unknown press deeper into his mind like a thumb against a bruise. Someone had returned to the site, someone who wasn't supposed to exist in the narrative they had neatly tried to stitch together, someone silent, careful, confident. And confidence only comes from two things: knowledge or ownership. The detective didn't like either option. He walked quickly back toward the station, pushing through the doors with a resolve sharpened by the gnawing sense that the case had just changed shape entirely. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Officers moved with urgency. Phones rang nonstop. The hum of fluorescent lights felt harsher, almost hostile. Something about the building itself seemed to pulse with adrenaline. As he stepped towards the observation window of the interrogation room, he saw the suspect sitting alone, head bowed, shoulders trembling. Not dramatically, not exaggerated. Just a subtle, involuntary shake of a man imprisoned by a memory that hadn't aged, hadn't softened, hadn't let go. The detective watched him through the glass, searching for any angle, any fragment of truth still buried beneath fear. But the suspect looked like someone who had reached his limit, someone who knew the rest of the story but was terrified of the ending. The detective opened the door slowly. The suspect didn't look up, but his jaw tightened as if sensing a shift in the air. "Look at me," the detective said, voice low. The suspect raised his eyes, and for the first time, the detective saw something beyond fear, something closer to resignation. "They went back," the detective said. "They disturbed the site. We know that now. So we're past pretending you're the only one." The suspect's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "You think I didn't try to forget? I tried. I lived a normal life. I made peace with the silence." "But they don't forget." His voice cracked sharply. "People like them don't disappear." A chill slid down the detective's spine, cold and sharp. "Tell me who they are?" The suspect shook his head rapidly, violently, hands gripping the edge of the table. "You don't understand what they're capable of. I thought the desert buried it. I thought time buried it. But you pulled it all back up." The detective leaned in until their eyes locked. "If someone else is involved, they're not just dangerous to you. They're a threat to everyone. I need a name." The suspect's voice dropped to a whisper. There was no name. The detective frowned. "What do you mean?" There was only a presence. They were already out there that night, watching, waiting, like the desert belonged to them. The detective's jaw tightened. The suspect wasn't being evasive. This was something else, something primal in his voice. Something that made the detective's pulse thrum with warning. Before he could press again, the door swung open with a sharp clack. Another officer stepped inside, urgency etched into every line of his face. "Sir, you need to see this." The detective inhaled sharply. "What now?" The officer handed him a tablet. On the screen was live drone footage, grainy black and white, but clear enough to see the coordinates, clear enough to see the movement. A figure, darting across the sand near the rockfall. Too fast, too smooth, moving like they understood every contour of the desert. No flashlight, no hesitation. A shadow skimming across the terrain with an unsettling grace that didn't belong in the harsh landscape. The detective froze. "How long ago was this?" "Less than 15 minutes. Drone caught it on a sweep, but when ground units arrived, nobody was there." A pressure built behind the detective's ribcage, something tight, something instinctive. He looked at the suspect. "Is that them?" The suspect's face drained of all color. His lips parted. He exhaled shakily. "They don't want the truth to come out." The detective's voice sharpened. "Then why show up now? Why go back to the site?" The suspect closed his eyes. "Because they knew you'd find something." The detective's mind raced. The long-lost evidence, the resurfaced items, the unexpected DNA, the sudden disturbance of the site. None of it aligned naturally. It was orchestrated, timed, deliberate. Someone was watching. Outside, officers shouted new orders. More vehicles were dispatched. The radio erupted with overlapping commands. The tension thickened to the point it felt like the whole station was suffocating under it. The detective stood abruptly. "You're not going anywhere," he told the suspect. "Not until I know exactly what happened." He stepped out of this room, closing the door behind him, and turned to his team. "Lock down the perimeter. Full sweep of the building. We're not ruling out anything." Officers dispersed immediately. The detective headed to the evidence room, his steps echoing sharply through the corridor. The air felt heavier here, as if every box and sealed bag carried its own breath, each whispering fragments of stories left unfinished. He entered the room, passing rows of shelves, scanning the area until he reached the newly logged items from the desert. The evidence sat beneath harsh white lights, but something was wrong. A drawer was slightly open. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to send a shiver crawling up his spine. He stepped closer, slowly, carefully. The air grew thick, still suffocating. He reached out and pulled the drawer open the rest of the way. One of the recovered items was gone. Not the box, not the metal object, something smaller. A strip of fabric, a fragment with dried dust embedded in its fibers. A piece believed to have belonged to the victim, missing. The detective's heart hammered once hard enough to feel in his throat. Then again. He turned sharply toward the door. Secure the evidence room, he barked. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wouldn't matter. Whoever had taken the fabric had slipped in and out without being seen, without triggering alarms, without disturbing anything more than a single drawer. Someone who understood procedure, someone who understood the building. Someone who knew exactly what mattered and what didn't. He headed back towards the interrogation room, each step faster than the last. His mind raced through possibilities, each one darker than the last. When he reached the door, he paused for a single second, steadying his breath, then pushed it open. The suspect looked up immediately, eyes wide. "You felt it, didn't you?" he whispered. The detective didn't answer. He didn't need to. The suspect could see the shift in his expression. "They were inside," the suspect murmured. "They came for it." The detective swallowed hard. "For what?" "The piece of fabric," the suspect said softly. "It wasn't supposed to survive. It wasn't supposed to be found. They're erasing what's left." The detective leaned forward. "Tell me what happened that night. All of it. Right now." The suspect's breathing quickened. "I didn't want to go out there. They told me it would be quick. They told me I just had to follow. But when we reached the ridge, they changed. Their face. It didn't look the same in the moonlight, like the desert reshaped them. Like they belonged to it in ways the rest of us don't." The detective felt a strange, unwelcome chill. The suspect wasn't speaking like a man recalling facts. He was recalling terror. "What did they do?" the detective pressed. A long silence. "They didn't walk away from the ridge," the suspect whispered. "They vanished into it." The detective exhaled slowly, forcing logic to drown out the rush of adrenaline. "You mean they ran?" "No," the suspect said firmly. "They disappeared, like the desert swallowed them." A beat of silence pulsed through the room. Then footsteps pounding down the hallway. Another officer burst in, breathless. "Sir, we found something outside. You need to come now." The detective hurried after him, heart racing. The night air hit him in a rush as they stepped out behind the building. Officers clustered around a patch of dirt near the chain-link fence. Flashlights swept the ground. There! A footprint. Deep, precise, pointing toward the station. Not away. Someone had been watching, standing close enough to study the building. Close enough to choose their moment. Close enough to take the evidence from right under their noses. The detective crouched, studying the imprint. The shape was unusual, long, narrow, almost too symmetrical. It didn't look like any boot he recognized. It didn't look like standard hiking gear. It looked deliberate, engineered, as if someone had gone out of their way to leave a footprint designed to be seen. The detective straightened slowly, pulse pounding. Whoever they weren't running. They were signaling. They wanted to be followed. Behind him, officers shifted uneasily, feeling the weight of something unseen watching from the dark. The detective stared into the empty desert stretching beyond the fence night, swallowing everything beyond the reach of their lights. The suspect's words echoed through his mind, chilling and unshakable. They don't disappear. They wait. The desert beyond the fence stretched into a black, breathing void, as if the land itself were watching the station with quiet, ancient patience. The detective stood motionless for a long moment, the wind brushing his face with a strange, almost deliberate chill, like a whisper against the skin. Flashlights swept across the ground in frantic strokes of white, but nothing moved except dust. The footprint remained in the center of the chaos, a silent message stamped into the earth with unsettling precision, as if the person who left it had all the time in the world, as if they knew no one would catch them. Officers murmured behind him, voices thick with dread. The detective didn't turn. His gaze stayed fixed on the empty desert, trying to feel the edges of a presence he couldn't see. Something about the air felt different. He'd worked cases his entire career, walked into scenes soaked in violence, interviewed people who could lie without blinking, but this was different. This felt like stepping into a story someone else had written, someone who preferred shadows instead of ink. Finally, he tore his eyes away and straightened. "Expand the search radius," he ordered, voice steady but hollowed out by adrenaline. Sweep every angle. If they're out there, they didn't get far. The officers scattered instantly. Engines roared. Flashlights stabbed deeper into the desert's throat. Radios crackled with clipped responses as units moved out in widening arcs. The detective stayed behind for a few seconds, letting the night press against him, letting it settle in his mind. Then he turned back toward the building. Inside, the station felt different, as if every corner had absorbed the tension building from outside. The fluorescent lights hummed like insects. The hallway smelled like dust and adrenaline. Officers moved faster now, shoulders tight, eyes sharp, as though expecting the walls to breathe. The detective walked toward the interrogation room again, but halfway down the corridor, a voice called after him. "Sir." He turned to see a forensics tech jogging toward him, clutching a plastic evidence bag and a tablet. "You need to see this." The tech's face was pale, almost waxy. "It's about the DNA." The detective motioned for him to follow into a nearby office. They entered, closed the door, and the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead flickered twice before settling into a cold, steady glow. The tech spread the files across the desk. We re-ran the profiles. Not just for accuracy, we compared degradation patterns, shelf life, everything. And there's something off. The detective leaned in. Off how? The second DNA sample, the unknown one, shouldn't be that intact after 24 years. The tech tapped the screen. It's too preserved, too clean, even for desert conditions. The detective's breath stilled, meaning the tech swallowed hard, meaning whatever left that DNA didn't leave it in 2001. Silence hit the room like a punch. The detective's pulse hammered in his ears. "Say that again." "The unknown DNA is modern," the tech whispered. "It's recent, as in months recent, maybe weeks." A chill poured down the detective's spine with cold, deliberate slowness. Someone had handled the long-lost evidence way after the crime. Someone had touched it before it was discovered. Someone had planted their DNA into it intentionally, or not. And it was found exactly where the drone saw the figure return. The detective forced his voice steady. "Run me a full profile, expanded markers. I want everything." "We already did." The tech hesitated. "There's more." He held out another evidence bag, this one containing a single strand of hair. "We found this stuck to the fabric before it was taken." The detective stared at it. A single hair shouldn't feel threatening, but the dread in the tech's eyes said otherwise. "What's wrong with it?" the detective asked. "It matches the unknown DNA," the tech whispered, "but the structure is abnormal." The detective frowned. "Abnormal how?" "It shows signs of extreme exposure, as if it came from someone who spends years outdoors, harsh environments, high UV exposure, conditions most people don't survive long in." The detective's mouth went dry. "Someone who lives in the desert," he murmured. The tech nodded slowly. "Someone who never left it." The detective's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He grabbed the evidence bag and walked out without another word, the tech trailing behind him like a shadow. As they approached the interrogation room, the detective slowed, looking through the glass. The suspect sat motionless, hands folded on the table, eyes empty, like someone who had finally accepted that whatever hunted him had returned, or never left. The detective stepped in. The suspect lifted his eyes, and the detective saw something new there, not fear, recognition. "They were here," the suspect whispered. "Weren't they?" The detective didn't answer. He placed the evidence bag on the table. "This hair," he said quietly, "it wasn't yours, it wasn't hers." The suspect's eyes widened, pupils trembling. "We found it before the fabric disappeared." The suspect inhaled sharply, lungs stuttering with panic. "You said they vanished into the ridge," the detective said. "What does that mean?" The suspect pressed his shaking hands to his temples. "You think I'm insane." "I think you're afraid," the detective said. "And right now, I need afraid more than I need sane. Tell me." The suspect's breathing turned ragged, each inhale sounding like gravel dragged across concrete. That night, he whispered, they moved differently. They knew where to step, where not to. They didn't leave a trail. They didn't speak. The desert listened to them. The detective felt a cold prickle along the back of his neck. "Are you talking about someone trained? Someone who grew up out there?" The suspect shook his head slowly. "No, someone who belonged to the land." The detective tried to stay grounded, logical rationale, but something about the footprint outside the missing evidence, the drone footage, the abnormal DNA, they all pointed to someone who knew the desert in a way that defied explanation. Before he could press further, the station lights flickered again. Then a blackout. Total darkness swallowed the room in an instant. A chorus of startled shouts echoed from the hallway. Radios crackled with static. Footsteps pounded against the concrete floor outside. The detective shot to his feet. Emergency lights flared on, bathing the hallway in a dull red glow like the inside of a siren. Officers ran in both directions, voices clipped and urgent. Power's out across the block. Backup generators aren't kicking in. Did someone cut the line? The detective pushed into the hallway, heart slamming against his ribs. Something was wrong, deeply, strategically wrong. He turned to the nearest officer. "Check perimeter cameras, now." The officer sprinted to the security office, but before he reached it, a voice shouted from down the hall. "Sir, we've got movement outside." The detective ran toward the back door, officers following close behind. They burst out into the night and froze. The desert was silent, perfectly still. But the footprint was gone. Not trampled, not faded. Gone, erased. As if someone had swept the earth clean with surgical precision. A crawling sense of dread wrapped around the detective's spine. He crouched, touching the dirt. It was smooth. Too smooth. A surface shaped deliberately. Behind him, the officers fanned out, scanning the darkness with trembling flashlights. Then a shout erupted from the far side of the fence. "Sir, over here." The detective rushed toward the beam of light cutting across the sand. There, half buried in the earth, was something new. A strip of fabric. Not the one stolen from evidence, another one. The detective picked it up. His breath stalled. It was fresh, clean, untouched by decades. Someone had left it there moments ago. A message, a warning, a signature. His radio crackled sharply. "Sir, the suspect." The detective spun around. "The suspect what?" "He's gone." The detective's pulse crashed into full panic. "Gone from where?" "The interrogation room," the officer shouted. "Sir, he's not there." The detective bolted toward the station, mind racing in jagged flashes. The suspect hadn't escaped. Couldn't have. He was terrified, cornered, unraveling. No, he hadn't run. He'd been taken. The detective pushed through the doorway, sprinting down the hall, shoving past officers. When he reached the interrogation room, the open door and empty chair hit him like a physical blow. "What the hell happened?" he barked. An officer pointed at the wall. A shadowy smear near the floor, a scuff mark that hadn't been there minutes earlier, and in the corner, a grain of sand. Just one. But the detective recognized its color instantly. It wasn't the sand from the station lot. It was desert sand. Desert sand from deep beyond the ridge, where sunlight rarely reached, where someone else had walked tonight. The detective felt the truth descend like a blade. Whoever had taken the evidence had just taken the suspect too. The moment the detective saw the empty chair, the world around him seemed to tighten, the walls contracting as if the entire station were exhaling in one long, horrified breath. Officers crowded the hallway, their voices a frantic blur of disbelief, accusations, and fear that ricocheted off every surface. The overhead lights flickered again, threatening another blackout, but the emergency circuits held, bathing everything in a sick red glow that made the scene look more like a crime scene than the room where they had tried to solve one. The detective stepped into the interrogation room, his shoes scraping against the concrete floor that felt colder than before, as if something ancient had seeped into it. He crouched beside the chair, examining the scuff mark near the wall, his fingers hovering just above it without touching. Something about the smear's direction suggested force, not from someone running, not from someone stumbling, but from someone being dragged. The angle of the mark was wrong for a voluntary escape. Too low, too sudden. He ran his hand along the edge of the table. Warm, too warm, as if a hand had gripped it moments earlier, holding on until the last second. Then he saw it. A faint line of disturbed dust near the baseboard leading toward the corner, hardly visible unless you were staring. A trail, not left by footsteps, but by something being pulled across the floor. Subtle, intentional, clean. Behind him, an officer spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. No sign of forced entry. "Check again," the detective said sharply. "We did," the officer insisted. "Every door, every window. No alarms tripped, no sensors triggered. Nothing." The detective clenched his jaw, so someone walked him out of the building without being seen. No one answered, because the truth was obvious. Whoever came for the suspect didn't walk him out. They moved in a way that bypassed everything. Sightlines, sensors, footsteps, cameras, as if they had rehearsed the path 1,000 times or shaped it themselves. The The detective stood abruptly and strode into the hallway, barking orders that cut through the panic like a blade. Lock down the block. No one leaves. Check every exit, every crawl space, every storage room. Officers scattered again, their footsteps slamming against the floor in a growing frenzy. The detective moved toward the security room at the end of the hall, his pulse hammering with each step. When he reached it, 2 techs were already pale-faced, frantically rewinding footage, scanning through frames so quickly the images blurred into streaks of distortion. "Show me the last 5 minutes," the detective demanded. One tech fumbled with the controls, pulling up the timestamp. The footage played the hallway in grainy monochrome, officers running shadows stretching under strobing lights. "Go slower." The tech adjusted the playback speed. The footage crawled frame by frame. Everything looked normal. Then something shifted, barely perceptible. A flicker in the hallway's far corner. Not a person. Not even clearly a shape. Just a distortion. A subtle warping of pixels, like heat rising from asphalt. It moved once, then again. Then it slipped out of frame. The detective's stomach dropped. "That wasn't a camera glitch," he said quietly. The tech swallowed. "Sir, whatever that was, it didn't show up on the other angles." The detective stared at the screen. The hallway was illuminated. Nothing should have been invisible. And yet the distortion had moved as though its presence didn't conform to the rules of light, slipping through them instead of reflecting off them. He leaned closer. Where was that in the building? The tech tapped the map in the corner of the screen, just outside the interrogation room. The detective felt something cold unfurl beneath his ribs, and the suspect disappeared exactly 90 seconds later. Another tech spoke up, voice trembling. "Sir, there's more." He clicked to another feed, this one from the exit tunnel behind the holding rooms, a passage rarely used except for maintenance. The footage showed an empty corridor, then a sudden blackout. Then the lights flickered back on. The corridor was empty, but the door at the far end was ajar by an inch. The detective straightened. They used the east exit. "That door has a coded lock," the tech whispered. "Only officers can open it." The detective's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "Run keycard logs." The tech typed rapidly. The screen populated with entries, then froze. No one had used the door for hours, but the door opened. Without a code, without a key, without triggering a log. The detective slammed a fist onto the desk. Someone manipulated the system. But not digitally, the tech said. There were no hacks, no external signals. The system didn't detect interference. So what the hell opened it? No answer came. The detective turned and stormed out of the room before his thoughts could twist into even darker places. He made for the east exit, moving quickly through the corridors until he reached the heavy steel door. 2 officers stood guard, looking uneasy. "We've checked the ground outside," one said. Nothing there. The detective pushed past them and stepped out into the night air. The door opened onto a narrow space between the station and the chain-link fence, lit by a single flickering lamp that cast more shadow than light. The ground was hard-packed, disturbed earlier by officers sweeping the area. He crouched, scanning the earth. Nothing. No footprints. No drag marks. No sign of a struggle. It was as if the suspect had been lifted clean off the ground. The detective exhaled slowly, rubbing a thumb over the back of his neck. Something brushed his hand, a low gust of wind carrying desert grit. It stung slightly sharp against the skin. He looked at his hand. Grains of sand. Same strange color as the grain found in the interrogation room. Sand that came from deeper desert terrain, not the outskirts of town. Something in the detective's chest tightened. Whoever took the suspect came from out there, and they brought the desert with them. He stood and looked into the darkness, beyond the fence, past the reach of the station's lights, where shadows swallowed everything without hesitation. A voice broke through the silence behind him. "Sir, we found something in holding." The detective turned. The officer's face was pale eyes wide. "What is it? You need to see for yourself." They hurried back inside, weaving through frantic officers and hurried voices. The holding wing felt colder than the rest of the station. The detective stepped into the last cell, the one directly beneath a ventilation shaft overhead. At first, he didn't understand what he was looking at. A small pile of sand on the concrete floor. Just sand. But beside it, a mark. A deep, deliberate mark carved into the wall. A vertical line, sharp, straight, etched so cleanly it looked like a blade had sliced into the concrete itself. Another officer stepped forward. It wasn't there before the blackout. The detective touched the mark gently. The edges were smooth, almost polished. The suspect couldn't have made it. Someone else had been inside the cell, and they had left a sign, a warning, a claim, a signature. The detective's radio crackled. "Sir Dispatch just got a call. Anonymous tip. You're going to want to hear this." He grabbed the radio. "This is the detective. Go." A faint, distorted voice bled through the static. "He didn't vanish," the caller whispered. "You're looking in the wrong direction." The detective's pulse climbed. "Identify yourself." The voice ignored him. "You won't find him in the desert." The detective's breath hitched. "Then where is he?" A long pause, too long. Then the whisper came sharp as broken glass. "He's beneath you." The radio cut out. Silence swallowed the station. The detective turned slowly toward the floor. The building's foundation was old enough to have crawl spaces, maintenance shafts, storm tunnels from decades ago, and something else. A forgotten lower level buried under renovations, a basement the city never used, never secured, never checked. He remembered the blueprints. He remembered the hollow space beneath the interrogation wing. His heart lurched. He sprinted down the hallway toward the maintenance stairs, shoving past officers, ignoring questions, ignoring the panic in their voices. He threw open the metal door and descended into darkness, his breath turning harsh, his footsteps echoing off cold concrete walls. The air changed as he reached the bottom, colder, denser, carrying the faint smell of dust untouched by time. He flicked on his flashlight. Its beam cut through the darkness. And there, in the center of the abandoned lower level, a trail of sand. A perfect, narrow line leading deeper into the shadows where the light couldn't reach. A chill crawled up the detective's spine. Someone had brought the suspect down here. Someone who moved through the station like it belonged to them. Someone who knew the places no one else remembered. The detective took a step forward, the beam trembling in his hand. And in the darkness ahead, something moved. The movement ahead was subtle, almost imagined, just the faintest ripple in the dark, as if the shadows themselves had turned to watch the detective approach. He froze, breath suspended, pulse thrashing in his ears like a heartbeat amplified through the walls. The beam of his flashlight shook slightly as he lifted it, slicing deeper into the hollow below the station. Dust swirled through the air in thin, ghost-like ribbons that spiraled away from the light, making the darkness beyond seem even thicker, even more unwilling to give up its secrets. He forced his legs to move. One step, then another. The sound of his boots against the floor was impossibly loud, echoing off pillars and forgotten utility pipes that ran overhead like exposed veins. The old basement stretched farther than he remembered, from the blueprint's long corridors extending into black tunnels that hadn't been used in decades. The trail of sand on the ground continued in a perfect, undisturbed line as if whoever left it had floated rather than walked. The detective followed it. The deeper he went, the colder the air became, stealing warmth from his lungs with every breath. His flashlight illuminated rusted pipes, peeling paint, crumbling concrete walls that looked like they were holding themselves together out of sheer habit. Every few feet he passed an old sign mounted crookedly to the wall, storm shelter maintenance access. Low-clearance remnants of a structure built for emergencies that had long been forgotten, abandoned to dust and darkness. Then he heard it. Not movement this time. Breathing. Not human breathing, something slower, deeper, heavier, like lungs expanding in a cavern. The detective's fingers tightened around the flashlight, and his free hand instinctively moved toward the handle of his holstered weapon. He swallowed hard, forcing the tension out of his hands enough to keep moving. The trail of sand turned left at a corner, where the ceiling dipped low. He ducked under a pipe and stepped into a narrow passageway. The air grew even colder here, sharp against his skin, carrying an earthy scent that didn't belong beneath a police station. The sand was thicker now, almost like someone had poured it in deliberate strokes. He reached a door at the end of the passage, a heavy rusted metal door with a cracked window. Something beyond it shifted. The detective raised his flashlight, shining through the dusty glass. A faint silhouette stood inside. He exhaled and reached for the door handle. It moved before he touched it. A soft metallic click echoed through the corridor as the door slowly creaked open by itself, pulling inward like an invitation. The detective stepped back instinctively, adrenaline spiking, breath tightening, but no one came out. No one lunged forward. The darkness remained still. He lifted his weapon and stepped inside. The room was old, an unused storage chamber with shelves that had collapsed against the wall. Metal beams buckled under years of neglect, and at the center of the floor, A chair. Scratched, bent, as if someone had dragged it across the ground. On the seat lay a single object. The detective approached slowly, light trembling over the shape. A radio. Not a police radio, a small battered handheld transceiver, dustless, recently handled. Beside it, something worse. A smear of dark red, blood still wet. The detective crouched, heart pounding, every muscle poised to react. Before he could examine the radio, a sudden burst of static pierced the silence. He jerked upright, weapon raised, scanning the shadows. The static wasn't coming from the device on the floor. It was coming from his own radio. He lifted it slowly. The speaker crackled. Then a voice, low and distorted, seeped through like a whisper rising from the earth beneath him. "You're close." Every hair on his arms rose. He tightened his grip. "Who is this?" Static, a faint exhale, then he's still alive. The detective's pulse slammed against his ribs. "Where is he? Identify yourself." But the voice ignored the command, sliding into something chillingly calm. "You should never have opened the case." "Tell me where he is." The detective snapped, fear igniting anger in his voice. The radio crackled again, one last whisper. "You're standing in the wrong room." Silence swallowed the line. The detective spun, sweeping the flashlight across every corner, every inch of shadow. Nothing. No movement. No sound. The breathing he'd heard earlier had vanished completely. He stepped away from the chair, forcing himself to scan the room again, slower this time. That's when he spotted it, another trail of sand, finer, harder to see, leading behind a fallen shelving unit and toward a small, low hatch built into the wall just inches above the floor. He hadn't noticed it before. It was too small for a person to walk through, but big enough for someone to drag something or someone through. The detective crouched, angling his flashlight into the hatch. The beam revealed a sloping tunnel lined with concrete that led deeper underground, far beneath the structure's foundation. The walls were coated with desert dust, as though connected to something outside the station footprint, some older structure or a forgotten drainage channel that opened into the earth. He hesitated only a moment before forcing himself inside, crawling through the narrow opening. The tunnel descended steeply, the earth pressing tightly around him. His elbows scraped concrete. The beam flickered. The air smelled of damp soil and something faintly metallic, like fear itself had a scent. The tunnel widened after several feet, opening into a subterranean corridor lit dimly by an emergency lamp mounted precariously on one wall. Its harsh glow carved out a long, straight path into the depths below the station. The sand trail continued clear as ever. The detective rose to his feet and followed it. His footsteps echoed sharply. The corridor's walls were lined with old pipes and conduits, some active, some dead. The structure hummed faintly, as though the building above were breathing through its foundation. Then another sound, a muffled cry. The detective froze. He strained to listen. Another cry, weak, choked off quickly. Not far. Someone was down here. He broke into a run, flashlight bouncing wildly along the walls. The trail of sand glimmered faintly under the beam. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, one filled with old electrical panels and crates piled high with forgotten equipment. And behind them, movement. He snapped the flashlight toward the sound. A figure, bent over something, lifting. The detective's weapon was already raised. Freeze. The figure's head snapped up. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its silhouette looked wrong. Too still, too calm. Its posture was stiff, almost unnatural, as if bones inside didn't align the way they should. "I said freeze," the detective barked, stepping forward. Slowly the figure straightened, not running, not hiding, facing him. And in that moment, the light caught something in its hands. A boot, still attached to a leg, a man's leg. The detective's breath punched out of him. "Where is he?" The figure said nothing. Then it stepped backward into deeper darkness, vanishing behind the stack of crates as if the shadows had swallowed it whole. The detective sprinted forward, weapon-aimed flashlight, slicing the dark. The figure was gone, simply gone. No footsteps, no trail, no sound of escape, only silence. And the suspect, lying on the ground behind the crates, unconscious, barely breathing, arms bound with fabric strips made from something weathered and old. The detective knelt beside him, fingers searching for a pulse. It was there, faint but alive. The suspect's lips twitched. He forced his eyes open. "They were here," he gasped. "I know," the detective said, voice tight. The suspect's fingers closed weakly around the detective's wrist grip, desperate. "You can't stop them," he whispered. "They've been in the desert too long." The detective swallowed, forcing steadiness into his voice. "Who are they?" The suspect's breath shuddered. "They don't have a name." His eyes rolled back. Lights above flickered. Something moved behind the detective, a whisper of air, a shift of weight, a breath that didn't belong to him. He spun around. Nothing. Only darkness stretching down the tunnel. But he could feel it. A presence lingering just beyond the edge of the light, watching, waiting, unfazed. As if the desert had sent something into the world that didn't fear walls, locks, or men. The detective lifted the suspect onto his shoulder, adrenaline drowning out exhaustion, and began retreating through the corridor with shaking breath. Behind him, far down the tunnel, a single sound echoed softly. A footstep, then another, measured, patient, coming closer. The footsteps in the tunnel were slow, deliberate, echoing with a rhythm that didn't belong to urgency or fear. They sounded like the steady pulse of something unhurried, something that knew the detective couldn't stay long enough to face what approached. With the suspect slumped over his shoulder, the detective forced himself forward, breath sharp and ragged as he maneuvered through the dim corridor. His flashlight bounced erratically, with each step casting warped shadows across the walls that twisted and snapped like stretched silhouettes, mimicking his panic. He reached the narrowing part of the tunnel where he had first crouched through, struggling now to fit with the weight of the unconscious man dragging him down. He had to lower himself, twisting sideways, pushing the suspect ahead, while the darkness behind grew thicker, swallowing the faint glow of the emergency lamp as if inhaling it. The footsteps continued, never speeding up, never slowing, just closing the distance with predatory patience. The detective's shoulder scraped concrete skin burning. He ignored it, shoving the suspect through the hatch. The man's limp body slid onto the basement floor above. The detective followed, forcing himself up and out, boots slipping on the dust. As he scrambled out of the tunnel, something brushed the back of his shoe, just a whisper of contact, barely perceptible, but enough to spike his heartbeat into a frenzy. He kicked back instinctively, sealing the hatch with a clang that echoed through the basement like a gunshot. He stood abruptly, chest-heaving, ears ringing. The basement was silent. Too silent. The air felt warmer here, but heavy, as though something thick and oppressive had seeped upward through the tunnel with him. He dragged the suspect to the wall, leaning him against a rusted pipe. The man's breaths came shallow and irregular, each one sounding like it might be his last. The detective pressed 2 fingers to the suspect's throat again, still alive barely. He turned toward the passage leading back up to the station, but a sudden gust of cold air swept across the floor, carrying grains of sand that skittered in all directions. He spun around. The hatch remained closed, but the sand settled itself into a thin line across the floor, pointing toward the stairwell as if marking a path. His skin prickled. The detective tightened his grip on his flashlight, supporting the suspect under one arm as they staggered toward the stairs. The climb felt endless. Every step vibrated faintly as though something below pressed upward, feeling for weak points in the structure. When he reached the first landing, he paused, listening. The basement behind them had fallen unnaturally silent again, like the absence of sound was its own presence. He took the remaining stairs 2 at a time, bursting through the maintenance door and into the station hallway. Officers rushed toward him in a blur of panic. "Sir, where did you find him? What happened down there? Is someone else in the basement?" The detective didn't answer. "Clear the lower level," he ordered, "and seal it once you're out. No one goes down without my command." He pushed through this crowd, helping the suspect into an empty room where medics were waiting. They lifted the man onto a gurney, immediately checking vitals, shining lights into his eyes, shouting observations. The detective stepped back, adrenaline vibrating under his skin, his mind racing with images of the figure lifting the suspect as if he weighed nothing, the sand trail, the unnatural disappearance behind the crates. A medic turned to him. "He's stable for now, but something's wrong. His blood pressure is crashing." Another medic frowned deeply. "He's dehydrated. Severely. More than someone should be after a few hours missing." The detective's stomach knotted. The suspect hadn't been missing long enough for dehydration to take hold like that, unless something had happened to him long before being dragged underground. The detective stepped out, the medic's words echoing like a warning. Officers lined the hallway waiting for orders. He paused only long enough to steady his breath. "No one leaves this building," he said. "Every exit stays locked. We have an intruder who knows this structure better than we do." A murmur rippled through the ranks. One officer stepped forward. "Sir, if someone is coming after him, won't they come after us next?" The detective met his eyes, voice low. "They already have." Before he could say more, the station lights flickered violently, plunging the hallway into darkness for a heartbeat. Officers stiffened hands, reaching instinctively toward weapons breaths freezing mid-inhale. The lights snapped back on, but the detective noticed immediately they were dimmer now, as if power was being drained from somewhere deep in the system. A radio crackled on someone's vest. Static washed over the hallway, then a series of sharp clicks. Morse code. The detective narrowed his eyes. "Who sent that?" "Not us," an officer whispered. The static clicked again, slower now. "Foghorn." The detective's jaw tightened. "Someone's signaling," he said, from inside the building. Before anyone could respond, another crackle of static erupted louder this time, almost like breathing pressed against a microphone. A faint whisper threaded through the distortion. "You brought him back." The detective's blood ran cold. "Trace that signal." Trying signals bouncing between internal lines, one officer said, hands flying across his device. "It's like someone routed it through every unused frequency in the building." "Find the origin," the detective repeated. It's coming from below us." The detective felt his pulse spike. "The basement." "No," the officer said slowly. "Lower." A chill swept the hallway like an Arctic wind. "Lower than the basement," another officer echoed. "There's nothing down there. That's bedrock." The detective didn't answer. He remembered the tunnel. The unnatural sloping corridor. The air from deep within the earth that smelled ancient and undisturbed. The emergency lamp someone had placed there. Someone who navigated the underground like it belonged to them. Before he could speak, a distant metallic groan echoed through the station. Officers turned in unison, eyes wide. The sound came again closer, like something heavy shifting against steel. The detective recognized the direction instantly. The evidence room. He bolted down the hallway, officers chasing after him. The door at the end of the corridor vibrated slightly, as if something on the other side pressed against it. The detective reached for the handle just as it stopped vibrating. The silence afterwards was worse. He threw the door open. The room was dark, completely dark. The overhead bulb had shattered glass scattered across the floor. The only surviving light came from emergency strips mounted near the ceiling, bathing the shelves in a faint red glow that made everything look submerged in blood. The detective lifted his flashlight. Every evidence drawer on the wall was open. Every single one. Contents torn out, scattered. Some of it shredded like paper caught in machinery, others missing entirely. Bags ripped, containers cracked open. It looked less like a burglary and more like something had sifted through memories, tossing aside what it didn't want. Then he saw the far wall. Sand, a smear of it in a streak long enough to have been left by a hand. Or a body. Officers behind him cursed under their breath. One stepped toward the sand, but the detective grabbed his arm. "Don't touch it." He moved closer, crouching flashlight, trembling just slightly. The streak was interrupted halfway by a deep indentation in the floor, a precise oval shape that pulsed with the memory of pressure. It wasn't made by a shoe, or a boot, or anything designed for human feet. As he leaned closer, a faint vibration hummed through the concrete. Thump. Not loud, not sharp, just heavy. The officer nearest the door stiffened. "Did you hear?" Thump. This time closer, directly beneath them. Every officer went still. The detective's flashlight shook in his grip. Thump. The vibration rattled shelves. Sand on the floor rippled. The detective felt adrenaline spike like an electric current. "Everyone out," he said quietly. "Now." But as they turned to move the radio on, his hip crackled again. A whisper seeped through. "You're too late." The detective spun, pointing the flashlight at every corner. No one. Nothing. Only the lingering voice in the static. "You can't keep him." He felt his stomach drop. "Keep who?" The static hissed then. "You don't understand the desert. He belongs to it now." The line went dead. Silence returned. The detective turned toward the hallway, ready to order additional lockdowns, when a scream tore through the station, sharp sudden echoing down the corridor like a blade slicing the air. Then another scream. Then frantic shouting. "Sir, the suspect, he's gone for medical." The detective ran. The medic's room was chaos equipment, thrown aside cabinets, overturned needles scattered across the floor. One medic sat slumped against the wall, dazed, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "What happened?" the detective demanded. The medic pointed weakly. He didn't walk out." The detective's voice hardened. "What do you mean?" The medic trembled. He was pulled. The detective's pulse hammered. "Pulled where?" The medic lifted a shaking hand and pointed at the ceiling. A ceiling tile was missing. Above it, a dark crawl space, sand trailing across the edges. The detective stared upward, breath-tight flashlight trembling. The suspect wasn't abducted from the station. He was being moved through it. By something navigating the structure like a living maze. Something that didn't walk hallways. Something that used ceilings, floors, vents, shadows. Something moving right now, inside the walls. The detective swore under his breath and stepped back. Behind him, faint above the empty ceiling, a sound. Dragging. Slow, steady, patient. Moving deeper into the building. Taking the suspect with it. The dragging overhead moved with a steady rhythm, a slow scraping whisper that traveled across the ceiling like something crawling inside the bones of the building. Officers ducked instinctively, eyes locked on the dark opening above the medic's room, their breaths sharp and uneven. The detective felt the hairs on his arms rise, each inch of his body, alert to a presence he still couldn't see. Only hear a presence that moved confidently across beams and pipes as though the station's skeleton had been built for it. He stepped beneath the opening flashlight, cutting upward into the narrow crawl space. The beam reached only a few feet before dissolving into darkness. Dust drifted down in soft clouds. Something shifted far inside the shadows, soft, measured, dragging weight. The detective turned sharply. "I need infrared up there. Thermal. Anything." "We're pulling up equipment now," an officer said, fumbling with a handheld scanner. "It'll take a moment." "We don't have a moment," the detective snapped. The dragging sound stopped. The sudden stillness hit the room like a held breath. Officers exchanged tense glances. The detective stepped back, weapon raised, listening. The silence overhead felt alive, as if something had pressed its ear to the ceiling, listening to them in return. Then, a metallic clang echoed from farther down the hall, followed by another and another. Something was moving again, but not above them anymore. Now inside the ventilation network, the sound ricocheting through ducts like a creature navigating tunnels with instinctive precision. The detective bolted into the hallway, sprinting toward the source of the noise. Officers poured after him, their boots slamming against tile radios, crackling frantic updates. The building seemed to shudder with each echoing impact, metal groaning under weight that shouldn't have been able to move so smoothly overhead. They reached the main corridor just in time to hear a vent grate crash onto the floor. Dust burst outward. The grate spun like a thrown coin before clattering still. The duct above it was empty, but sand poured out in a thin stream, hitting the floor in a small cascade that formed a perfectly straight line, leading toward the holding wing. The detective didn't hesitate. He followed the sand pulse hammering flashlight beam, jerking across walls and door frames. Officers struggled to keep up as he turned sharply into the wing, only to freeze halfway down the hall. Every cell door was open. All of them. Not broken, not forced, simply unlocked. Swinging gently as though touched by an absent breeze. And in the center of the hall, lying under the dripping red glow of emergency lights, a boot. The same boot the figure had been holding in the underground chamber. But now, the boot was clean. No blood. No dirt. As though someone had washed it before placing it here deliberately, precisely waiting for them to find it. The detective crouched slowly, his breath shallow, his fingers hovering just above the leather. A faint warmth radiated off it, fresh, recently handled. A whisper of movement echoed behind him, barely audible but unmistakable. He spun. Nothing. Empty cells, open doors, silence thick enough to choke on. One of the officers stepped closer. "Sir, what does this mean?" Why take him through the ceiling just to... A scream split the air. Sharp, terrified. Not from inside the station. From below. The detective's blood turned to ice. He ran toward the stairs leading down to the lower level, every muscle in his body surging with instinct and dread. Officers followed, weapons raised, breaths ragged. The scream came again, echoing up the stairwell, distorted by distance, filled with a kind of fear that didn't belong to someone merely in danger. It belonged to someone who had seen something. The detective shoved the stairwell door open, racing down steps that groaned under his speed. The temperature dropped with each floor, the air turning colder, heavier. The emergency lights flickered, as if reacting to something moving close by. When he reached the landing above the basement, a burst of static crackled through every radio in the group. Officers flinched. Then a voice broken, gasping, barely coherent, filtered through. "Get away! He's..." The transmission cut out with a wet, abrupt choke. The detective's skin crawled. He pushed through the final door. The basement floor was darker than before, the air thick with dust that swirled in restless spirals. Flashlights bobbed through the gloom as officers fanned out their beams, slicing into corners behind pipes across toppled shelving. But the sand trail was back, a new one. Fresh grains glittered under the lights, forming a path that curved along the wall and toward the far end of the basement, the section that hadn't been used in decades, where even the blueprints grew faint and unreliable. "Sir," an officer whispered, voice tight. "No one should even be able to get over there. The floor's unstable." The detective ignored him and followed the trail. Each step forward made the air denser, as though pushing through invisible weight. Something pulsed beneath the concrete, a steady vibration that resonated faintly through the soles of his boots, something large, something deep. He reached the final corridor. A low hum seeped from the darkness ahead. The detective raised his weapon. "Flood it with light," he ordered. Officers swept their flashlights forward, beams intertwining like frantic blades cutting through thick smoke. And then the corridor revealed itself. The walls were covered in Mark's long vertical scratches, carved into concrete, dozens of them, all the same length, all perfectly spaced. They ran from floor to ceiling, like tally marks, counting something impossible to fathom. Some were old, filled with dust. Others looked fresh edges, sharp dust scattered around them, untouched by time. One officer stepped closer. "What are these?" "They're not random," the detective said quietly. "They're deliberate. Patterns." As he moved further, he saw something else at the end of the corridor. A door. Old, heavy, reinforced. But it wasn't the door that made his breath catch. It was the fact that the door was open. Not wide, just enough. Like someone had slipped through and left it ajar out of courtesy. He approached each step, slower than the last flashlight, trembling slightly in his hand. Officers stayed a few paces behind, as though instinct told them not to get too close. He pushed the door. Its hinges groaned, echoing like a dying breath. The flashlight beam expanded into the room, and the detective froze. There in the center of the chamber, the suspect sat upright against the wall, eyes open, breathing fast, chest heaving. Alive, but barely. His wrists were bound again, but this time with fresh strips of cloth wound so tightly the skin beneath had gone pale. Sand clung to his hair, his clothes, his eyelashes. He turned his head slowly, eyes locking onto the detective. They were wild, bloodshot, filled with terror, so raw it cut deeper than any wound. "They're here," he whispered. His gaze shifted past the detective, to the far corner of the room. The detective snapped his flashlight toward it. Something stood there. A shape, still, tall, unmoving. A silhouette emerging from the shadows with impossible quiet. Not wearing darkness, becoming it. The detective lifted his weapon hand, trembling as every instinct screamed at him to back away. But before he could speak, the figure inhaled, slow, deep, a breath like wind passing through a cavern. Then it stepped forward. Light hit its form, and the detective felt his mind stutter. It wasn't a stranger, it wasn't a monster, it wasn't a drifter. It was a man. A man whose face was cracked by sunskin, weathered into leather hair, coarse with dust, eyes hollowed into dark, empty sockets that reflected nothing human. But what struck the detective hardest was that the man looked like he hadn't lived in society for years. Maybe decades. Maybe since the night of the crime. Sand fell from his clothes as he moved, each grain catching the light like tiny sparks. He took another step. The suspect whimpered. Officers raised their weapons. The man lifted his head, voice scraping out like something dragged across stone. "You should not have brought him back." The lights above flickered. Sand trickled from the ceiling, from the walls, from the man himself. And the detective realized the desert had not sent him. He had come from the desert, and he wanted the suspect returned, alive or dead. The man stepped fully into the light, and the room seemed to shrink around him, walls contracting air, thinning with each grain of sand that slipped from his clothes. His presence wasn't loud or violent. It was quieter than silence, the kind of quiet that makes every instinct in the body pulse with warning, telling you that something has entered the room that doesn't fear anything. Not the armed officers, not the lights, not the detective pointing a weapon at his chest. The suspect pressed his back harder against the wall, breath-hitching eyes fixed on the man with an expression that blended recognition and dread, like he was seeing not just a person but a memory forced back into flesh. The detective lifted his gun, higher voice, sharp and steady, despite the tremor rising in his spine. "Don't move." The man tilted his head slightly as though listening to something far away, something beneath the floor or inside the walls. His eyes were dark voids under the emergency lighting, absorbing the red glow rather than reflecting it. His lips cracked as he spoke again, his voice scraping the air like dry leaves. "You should not have opened what was meant to stay buried." The detective tightened his grip. "Step away from him, now!" But the man didn't step. He didn't even seem to consider the order. Instead, he dragged his gaze slowly across the room, over the officers, over the walls, carved with vertical marks over the trail of sand behind him. His movements were slow, almost deliberate, like someone reacquainting themselves with an old place rather than intruding on a new one. One of the officers shifted nervously, boot-scraping the floor. The man's head snapped toward the sound with unnatural speed, a blur of motion that made every officer in the room flinch. His face contorted not in anger, but in something like recognition. His voice dropped into a rough whisper. "You've forgotten how to listen." The detective steadied his stance, forcing himself not to step back. "I'm warning you, don't come any closer." The man stepped closer, not fast, not aggressively, but with the calm assurance of someone who believed nothing in the room could stop him. Weapons clicked up in unison. Officers' breaths tightened. Sand trickled again from the man's sleeves, pooling gently at his feet. The suspect squeezed his eyes shut, whispering a single word through clenched teeth. "Please." The man stopped just before the circle of flashlight beams converging on him. Dust swirled faintly around his ankles. He lifted his hand not toward the officers, not toward the detective, but toward the suspect. His fingers curled slowly, beckoning in a gesture so subtle it felt ancient, like a gesture whispered through generations of desert stories. "He belongs to the silence now," the man said. The detective felt something prick the edges of his mind, not fear exactly, but a strange pull like the desert itself had spoken through the man's voice. Something deep, something older than the station, older than the town, older than the cold case they thought they were solving. "Get on the ground!" an officer shouted. The man didn't acknowledge the command. Instead, he took another step forward. This time, the detective reacted. His finger tightened on the trigger, but the man moved faster. Not human fast? He seemed to fold backward into the darkness behind him, a ripple of motion so fluid, the beam of the flashlight passed through empty air a moment later. Officers jerked their weapons, sweeping the room with frantic arcs of light. The detective spun heart-racing eyes, hunting for a shadow, a movement, anything. Then the sound came, behind them. The detective whipped around. The man was now standing on the opposite side of the suspect. No one had heard him move. No one had seen him pass. He simply existed there. The suspect let out a strangled gasp, half cry, half plea. The detective lunged forward, but the man raised a hand not to strike, not to block, but to command stillness. The detective froze mid-step. Not because of fear, not because of power, but because the ground beneath his feet vibrated faintly subtle, but unmistakable, like something huge shifting below the chamber. Officers stumbled, looking down. The concrete trembled again, weakly, then stronger still. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in soft clouds. Pipes overhead groaned. The man's eyes lifted slightly, as if acknowledging the vibration like a familiar friend. "You hear it now," he whispered. The detective pushed through the fear and forced his voice out. "What's beneath us?" The man smiled faintly, not kindly, not cruelly, just knowingly. "The place where the lost go when the world above forgets them." The suspect shook his head violently. "I didn't want to go back. I didn't—" "Silence," the man said, and the word hit the air like a physical weight. The suspect collapsed into a shivering ball against the wall. The detective took another step, weapon raised. "Move away from him." The man finally turned to face the detective fully. And in that moment, the detective saw the truth he had been trying to ignore. The man wasn't injured. He wasn't starving. He wasn't dehydrated like someone lost in the desert for years. He was adapted. His skin had hardened to the texture of stone. His hair had thinned into coarse threads like dried brush. His eyes had become pits, used to seeing in darkness. His clothes were a patchwork of weathered fabric fused with sand. This wasn't someone who had survived the desert. This was someone who belonged to it, and he wasn't alone. A faint whisper drifted from the corridor, hundreds of grains of sand cascading in a pattern that wasn't random. Officers twisted toward the sound. The lights flickered. The tremors intensified. Dust spiraled down like ash. Then far in the hall, another silhouette appeared. Then a second. Then a third, all standing perfectly still in the dim red glow. All shaped like the first man, sun-carved faces, sand-worn clothes, movements barely perceptible, as if they had risen from the earth. The detective's heart slammed into his ribs. The man near the suspect tilted his head again. The desert does not like what you have done. What did we do? The detective shouted over the rising tremor. You disturbed what was meant to sleep, the man whispered. You pulled memories from the ground that were buried with intention. The walls shuddered. Officers gripped their weapons, harder knuckles whitening. The detective stepped between the man and the suspect. If you want him, you'll have to go through me. The man regarded him quietly, like studying an animal that didn't understand the rules of the terrain it stood on. You don't understand, he said. Explain it, the detective growled. The man pointed to the suspect. He made a promise to the desert. The suspect sobbed. I didn't mean... The floor buckled slightly. Cracks snaked through the concrete like lightning. The man took one final step. Whether he lives or dies is not your choice. The detective raised his weapon fully. Stay back! The man didn't move. He simply exhaled. The lights exploded with a pop. Darkness swallowed the room. Officers shouted. Flashlights whipped around in frantic beams. But the man's voice rose clearly through the chaos. You must give him back. A blast of cold air swept the corridor, sucking dust and sand into a spiral. The detective shielded his eyes, coughing. Officers bent low, blinded by the sudden rush of grit. When the air settled, the man was gone. The silhouettes in the hall had vanished. The tremor in the ground faded. The scratching marks on the walls stood still again. The only sound was the suspect's ragged breathing. The detective swept the flashlight slowly across the room, then stopped. The suspect's bindings had been cut cleanly, precisely. Like a blade made of stone had sliced them. The suspect slumped forward onto his hands, trembling violently, eyes wide with terror. They're going to take me, he whispered. They're not finished. The detective knelt, gripping his shoulders. Tell me who they are. The suspect shook his head, tears streaking through dust. They're the ones who never came back. The ones who stayed in the desert until the desert swallowed them. They don't age. They don't starve. They don't forget. His voice cracked into a sob. They kept the secrets. We broke the pact. The detective's voice hardened. What pact? The suspect whispered one final sentence, breath shaking with terror. The desert protects what dies in it and punishes anything dragged back out. Before the detective could respond, every radio in the room crackled to life at once. A whisper filled the air. Not a man's voice. Not a human one. Something deeper, older, moving like wind over dunes. He does not belong to you. The flashlight beams flickered violently, and behind the detective, sand began leaking from the cracks in the walls.